Welcome back for another deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Today we're doing things a little differently. Well, the topic's different, of course, but I mean,
Right.
I was going to say we're going international.
Yeah,
We're going to Spain,
that's right.
but not for the beaches or the food or anything like that.
No. We are going into the political sphere.
That's right. We're diving into Spanish politics with this book, El arte de la manipulación política by Joseph M. Collamer.
And this book is fascinating because it really digs deep into how Spain transitioned from dictatorship to democracy in the 1970s.
Yeah, I mean, that's a wild ride to even think about how a country could go through such a huge transformation. So I'm really curious to see.
It is a fascinating story.
Yeah, like what does this book even focus on? Like, how do they even begin to tackle that?
So Collamer uses this really interesting blend of like game theory and voting analysis to break down the strategies and alliances that actually made that transition possible.
Okay, so it's not just like a history book. It's like a political thriller almost.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a political thriller, but with like, data and logic.
Right. Instead of car chases, we've got
Exactly.
voting patterns.
Voting patterns in game theory.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So where do we even begin with this whole transition? Like, what were the major forces at play?
One of the first things Collamer emphasizes is the importance of what he calls preference orderings.
Preference ordering.
Yeah, it's a fancy way of saying that it's not just about who has the biggest group wanting something. It's about how everyone ranks their options.
Okay, so like let's say you're trying to pick a restaurant with a group of friends, and
Yeah.
most people might say, "Oh, I like pizza."
Right.
But if pizza's not an option, then what?
What's their second choice?
Right. Do they want tacos? Do they want sushi? Like,
Exactly.
ranking matters.
Yeah, so that's preference orderings.
Okay, so how does that apply to like Spain in the 1970s?
Well, think about it like this. In the 1970s, Spain, it wasn't just about who wanted democracy. It was about how they ranked it compared to other options, like revolution continuing with the dictatorship. There were other things on the table.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it wasn't just a simple yes or no to democracy.
No, not at all. It was way more complex.
It's making my brain hurt already.
And this helps explain why sometimes democracy doesn't win, even if it seems like most people want it.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because their second or third choices might end up being more decisive.
Oh, that is fascinating.
Yeah. And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so we're already talking about strategy here.
We are definitely in the realm of strategy.
Right, because if you know how people are ranking their choices, then you can kind of like
You can play the game a little bit.
play the game exactly.
You can nudge people certain directions.
Right, so how does this play out in Spain's transition?
That's where game theory comes in.
Oh, yeah, this sounds complicated.
It sounds fancy, but it's really just a way of analyzing how people make decisions in situations where their choices affect each other.
Okay, I'm following.
So in politics, it's all about anticipating what your opponents will do
Right.
and then figuring out the best move to make based on that.
It's like a giant game of chess.
It's a giant game of political chess.
Like that.
And one of the key players Collamer highlights in this game is Adolfo Suarez.
Adolfo Suarez, okay.
He was appointed prime minister by King Juan Carlos during this really pivotal time.
Okay, so who was this guy? Was he like a big political figure before all of this?
Not really, and that's part of what made his appointment so interesting.
Okay, I'm intrigued already.
So the king, Juan Carlos, he heavily relied on this guy named Torquato Fernandez Miranda for political advice.
Okay, I've never heard of this guy.
Yeah, he was kind of a behind-the-scenes political mastermind.
Oh.
And he was known for picking candidates who could fly under the radar so they wouldn't cause a huge uproar from either side.
Oh, so like someone who was acceptable to both the old guard and the reformers?
Exactly, who's looking for someone who could bridge that divide.
Okay, so how did Suarez fit into all this?
Well, Suarez had a phalangist background, which means he had ties to the old Francoist establishment.
Oh, okay, so he wasn't seen as a threat to them.
Exactly. But he was also known to be a reformer at heart.
Oh, so he's kind of playing both sides a little bit.
He was walking a tightrope, for sure.
Okay, I can see how that would be a strategic move.
A brilliant strategy.
So he's prime minister. What does he do?
One of his biggest moves was pushing through this thing called the Reform Law.
Reform law. Okay, and what was that?
This was a crucial step towards democracy. But here's the catch.
Uh-oh.
The existing legislature, known as the Cortes, was mostly made up of Franco supporters.
Oh, so they were probably not too keen on reform.
They were not fans. They were called procuradores.
Procuradores. Okay, I'll
Yeah.
try to remember that.
So Suarez had to find a way to get them to vote for something they fundamentally opposed.
That sounds impossible.
It sounds like it, right?
Yeah.
But he had a plan.
Okay, I'm all ears.
He used this tactic that Colomer calls decantamiento.
Decantamiento. Okay, that sounds very Spanish.
It basically means creating this perception that reform is inevitable.
Oh, so it's not about convincing people that reform is good. It's about making them feel like they're going to miss out if they don't get on board.
Exactly. It's like starting a dance party and making it look so fun that even the most reluctant people feel like they have to join in.
Okay, that's a great analogy.
So Suarez starts offering incentives to these procuradors,
Like what?
like promising them Senate seats in the new democratic system if they vote for the reform law.
Oh, wow. So he's like bribing them to vote for democracy.
Well, you could see it that way.
That's kind of amazing.
It's definitely strategic.
That is amazing.
And as more and more of them started to think that change was unavoidable, they switched sides.
Oh, they don't want to be left behind.
Nobody wants to be on the losing team.
Wow. So Suarez manages to pull this off. He gets this reform law passed and paves the way for democratic elections.
He did. It was a huge victory.
But even then, the story's not over, right?
Oh, no, not at all.
Spanish politics, I'm guessing it never really ends.
Well, there's always another chapter.
Right. So what happens next?
Well, Spain holds its first democratic elections in 1977.
Okay, big moment.
Huge moment. And this is where Colomer's analysis gets even more fascinating.
Okay, how so?
He points out that even though the electoral system was intended to be proportional,
Right.
it actually ended up distorting representation in some pretty significant ways.
Wait, so they were trying to create a fair system, but the way it was set up actually created winners and losers from the get-go.
It did. It's like building a house with a slightly crooked foundation.
And eventually that foundation is going to crack.
Exactly. And it raises some really important questions about how the rules of the game can shape the outcome.
Yeah, even when everyone's supposedly playing fair.
Right.
So give me an example, like how did this play out in the 1977 elections?
Well, Suarez's party, the UCD, they won a majority in parliament, even though they didn't actually get a majority of the votes.
Well, how is that possible?
I only got about 34.4%.
Wow, so even though it was a democracy, the system itself was kind of rigged in favor of the bigger parties.
It definitely gave them an advantage.
That seems like it would make it really hard for new voices or smaller parties to break through.
It did. And here's the kicker, that same electoral system is still in place today.
Oh, wow. So those same distortions, those built-in advantages and disadvantages, they're still influencing Spanish politics decades later.
They are. It makes you think about how the rules we create can have these long-lasting consequences, even if they weren't intended.
That's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. It's a reminder that the political game is never really over.
Okay, so we've got strategic maneuvering, a clever politician playing the system, and an electoral system that's not quite as fair as it seems. Where do we go from here?
Well, now we're getting into some of the really complex issues that Spain still grapples with today, like regional identities and the role of language in politics. And that's where the next part of our deep dive begins.
Okay, so we're back and we're still in Spain trying to untangle this whole transition to democracy thing.
It's a fascinating story with a lot of twists and turns.
Yeah, Colomer's book has already shown us how strategic thinking and this kind of wonky electoral system really shaped things.
It's all about understanding the rules of the game.
But now we're getting into some even trickier territory, right?
We are. We're moving into the realm of cultural and linguistic identities.
Oh boy, those are always fun.
Well, they're definitely complex, especially in a country like Spain with such strong regional identities.
Yeah, I mean, Spain, it's not like one big homogenous blob.
Not at all.
You've got different regions with their own languages, their own cultures, their own histories.
And those differences, they become part of the political game.
Right, so it's not just about left versus right anymore.
No, it's about navigating these different identities and interests.
And finding a way to make it all work together.
That's the challenge.
So where do we even begin with this whole identity thing?
Well, Colomer dives into this really interesting case study, the Catalan question.
The Catalan question. Okay, and what is that exactly?
So in Catalonia, there's this strong push for the use of Catalan over Spanish.
Okay, so it's about language.
It is, but it's about more than just language.
Right, it's about what language represents.
Exactly. It's about identity. It's about culture.
And maybe even power.
Power is definitely part of the equation.
So who are the main players in this Catalan question game?
Well, you've got the Catalan nationalists who are advocating for Catalan language and culture.
Okay.
Then you've got immigrants who might not speak Catalan.
Right.
And then you've got the central government in Madrid trying to balance it all out.
So it's a three-way tug of war.
It's a multiplayer game with high stakes.
And I'm guessing game theory comes in handy here again.
It does. It helps us understand how different strategies by each player can lead to very different outcomes.
Okay, so give me an example.
Imagine the Catalan nationalists push really hard for Catalan exclusivity. No Spanish allowed.
Okay.
That might alienate immigrants and actually lead to more conflict.
Right, that'd feel excluded.
Exactly. But if they're more open to bilingualism, to integrating Spanish speakers,
Then it could be more harmonious.
it could lead to a more inclusive society.
So it's about finding that balance.
It's a delicate dance.
And this balancing act, it's not just happening in Catalonia, right?
No, not at all. Colomer also talks about the Basque Country.
Oh, yeah, the Basque Country, another region with a strong identity.
And their own language, of course.
Right, and they've had a history of conflict with the central government.
They have. And Colomer brings up ETA, the Basque separatist group.
Oh, yeah, ETA, I remember hearing about them in the news.
They used violence to try and achieve their goals.
So now the stakes are even higher.
Much higher, and you've got this incredibly tense situation.
Right, because now it's not just a debate about language or culture.
It's about security. It's about potential violence.
So how does Colomer analyze this?
Again, he uses game theory to illustrate this delicate balance of power.
Okay.
He shows how the Spanish government, the Basque government, and ETA, they're all making these calculated moves trying to outmaneuver each other.
Oh, man, it's like a high-stakes game of chess.
It is, and the consequences of a wrong move could be devastating.
So it's not just about winning or losing.
It's about finding a way to de-escalate the conflict, to reach some kind of peaceful resolution.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
It is, and Colomer even brings up this concept called the prisoner's dilemma.
Prisoner's dilemma. Okay, that rings a bell, but I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
Okay, imagine two suspects are arrested.
Okay.
They're held in separate cells, and they can either stay silent or confess to the crime.
Right. Classic good cop, bad cop scenario.
Exactly. So if they both stay silent, they both get a lighter sentence.
Okay, that makes sense.
But if one confesses and the other stays silent, the one who confessed gets off easy, while the other gets a much harsher sentence.
Oh, so there's an incentive to betray the other person?
Exactly. And if they both confess, they both get a moderate sentence.
So the best outcome for both of them is to cooperate and stay silent.
Right. But there's that risk that the other person will betray you.
And that fear can lead to both of them making choices that end up hurting them both.
Exactly. And Colomer argues that this same dynamic plays out in politics all the time.
Oh, I see. So like in the Basque Country, each player is kind of acting in their own self-interest, but it might actually lead to more conflict for everyone.
That's the dilemma. The rational choice for each individual can lead to a worse outcome for the group.
Wow, that's kind of depressing.
It is. But it's also a reminder that we need to find ways to overcome this self-interest to cooperate for the greater good.
Okay, so we've talked about strategic maneuvering, electoral systems, regional identities. Now the prisoner's dilemma, my brain is officially full.
We've covered a lot of ground.
But there's one key player we haven't really talked about yet, the king.
Ah, yes, the king.
Where does he fit into all of this?
Well, Colomer argues that while he doesn't have the same kind of direct power as the prime minister, his influence is still huge.
Okay, so he's not just a figurehead.
Not at all. He's a symbol of tradition and continuity.
Right. And that gives him a certain authority.
Especially in moments of crisis.
Like the 1981 coup attempt.
Exactly. That's a perfect example.
So what happened there?
A group of military officers tried to overthrow the government.
Oh, wow. That's intense.
It was a really tense moment for Spain's young democracy.
So how did the king stop it?
Colomer describes how he used his position and his personal connections to persuade military leaders to abandon the coup.
Oh, wow. So it was like behind-the-scenes diplomacy.
Exactly. He was working the phones, calling in favors, using his influence to save the day.
So he was a key player in preserving democracy.
He was, and it shows how power can manifest itself in unexpected ways.
Right. It's not always about who has the most votes or the loudest voice.
Sometimes it's about who understands the nuances of the system and who can wield power discreetly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. The transition to democracy, the strategies that shaped it, the challenges that Spain still faces today.
It's been quite a journey.
And it feels like Colomer's book is more than just a history lesson. It's a guide to understanding how power operates.
It is. It's about recognizing the patterns, the strategies, the games that people play to get what they want.
And those games, they're not just happening in Spain, right?
No, they're happening everywhere in politics, in business, in our personal lives.
So it's like he's giving us the secret decoder ring for understanding the world.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
It's about becoming more aware of the forces at play around us.
And maybe even learning how to play the game ourselves.
Exactly, but playing it ethically and responsibly.
Right, using our knowledge for good, not for evil.
Exactly, that's the key.
Okay, so we've learned a lot about Spain's transition to democracy. But what about the future? Where does Colomer think Spain is headed?
That's a great question, and it's where his analysis gets really thought-provoking. He suggests that Spain faces this fundamental trade-off.
A trade-off, okay, between what?
Between stability and pluralism.
Okay, so on the one hand, you've got the desire for stability after decades of dictatorship.
Right, people want order, they want predictability.
Makes sense.
But on the other hand, you've got the need for a truly pluralistic system.
Right, one that represents all voices and interests.
Exactly. And Colomer argues that the current system favors stability over pluralism.
So it's like they swung the pendulum so far away from authoritarianism that they ended up with a system that's maybe a bit too cautious.
That's a good way to put it. It's like they're so afraid of rocking the boat that they end up silencing some voices.
And that can lead to problems down the road?
It can, because those voices that aren't being heard, they might eventually erupt in frustration.
Right, it's like if you keep ignoring a problem, it's not going to magically disappear.
It might even get worse.
So this tension between stability and pluralism, it feels like that's something that democracies all over the world are struggling with.
You're absolutely right. It's this constant balancing act trying to create a system that's both stable and inclusive.
And there's no easy answer.
No, there isn't.
Yeah.
But recognizing this tension, understanding the trade-offs involved, that's the first step towards finding solutions.
Wow. We have been on quite a journey through Spanish politics.
We have, and it's amazing how much we can learn from just one book.
Seriously, Colomer's book has given us so much to think about, from strategic maneuvering to electoral systems to this whole idea of stability versus pluralism.
It's like he's giving us a backstage pass to how democracy really works.
Exactly. And the thing that keeps sticking with me is that even though he's focusing on Spain, these dynamics are happening everywhere.
That's what's so fascinating about this book. It's not just about Spain. It's about understanding power dynamics in any democracy.
I was thinking the same thing. Like, I keep seeing connections to my own country, the way our political parties operate, the compromises they make, the decisions they prioritize.
It's all there. It's like Colomer has given us this new lens through which to view the world.
And suddenly everything starts to make a little more sense.
Right, you start to see the patterns, the strategies, the games that are being played.
But it's not about becoming cynical or jaded.
Not at all. It's about becoming more informed, more engaged.
More aware.
Exactly. It's about empowering ourselves to be critical thinkers, to question assumptions, to see the hidden motives behind the actions of our leaders.
So it's not about throwing our hands up and saying, oh, well, it's all rigged anyway.
No, it's about saying, okay, I see the game now, and I'm going to play it in a way that aligns with my values.
In a way that makes a positive difference.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping the future of our democracies.
We're not just passive observers. We're active participants, and our choices matter.
They do. Every vote we cast, every conversation we have, every action we take, it all contributes to the direction of our society.
And that brings us back to Colomer's main argument about the art of political manipulation.
Right. It's not just about politicians being sneaky or underhanded.
It's about understanding how power works.
And knowing how to use it effectively to achieve your goals.
And those goals can be positive or negative.
Exactly. It depends on who's wielding that power and for what purpose.
So it's like learning martial arts.
I like that analogy.
You could use those skills to hurt someone.
Or you could use them to protect yourself and others.
It all comes down to your intentions.
And your understanding of the potential consequences.
So Colomer's book, it's like a martial arts manual for democracy.
I love that it teaches us the moves, the strategies, the counter moves.
But it's up to us to decide how we use that knowledge.
To use it wisely. To use it for good.
So in a way, it's actually quite empowering.
It is, because it shows us that we're not powerless.
We're not just pawns in some grand political game.
We can learn the rules, we can understand the strategies.
And we can even start to influence the outcome.
To create a better world for ourselves and for future generations.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have, from the specifics of Spain's transition to democracy
to these broader questions about power and democracy itself.
It's been a fascinating journey.
But before we wrap up, I always like to ask my guests for their final takeaway. Like, if our listeners could walk away from this conversation with just one big idea.
What would it be?
What would it be? I would say this democracy is a game. And like any game, it has rules, strategies, and players who are constantly trying to outmaneuver each other. Okay.
But the stakes in this game are incredibly high.
They are.
They involve our communities, our rights, our future.
So we can't afford to be passive?
No, we need to understand how this game is played.
We need to recognize the moves and counter moves.
And we need to use our knowledge and our voices to shape the outcome.
To make sure that democracy truly works for everyone.
That's the challenge, and that's the opportunity.
Well said. That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners out there, keep those brains engaged, keep those critical thinking skills sharp, and we'll see you back here soon for another deep dive into the world of ideas that matter.